So let's talk about your story.
Yeah.
I'll tee it up for you because it's a good one.
Yeah, well, good to see you all this morning. Thanks for being here. So my mom's name is Rebecca, and she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease in her late 40s. And that was for me my freshman year of college. She passed away 7 years ago at 61. And as a young adult, me and my sisters were primary and adjacent caregivers.
How many siblings do you have?
I have two older sisters.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then describe that process of the stress on the family.
Yeah, so I think my mom had been having symptoms for a while before she realized something was wrong. I remember she would make a lot of jokes about like, I'm crazy, I'm mixing things up. But one time she was reading like a US News magazine, and my mom was a speech pathologist, so she was well read, and she knew that she couldn't understand the article in the magazine, but that she should be able to. And that began her and my dad going to say, okay, what's wrong? And it took a couple years to get to that diagnosis.
So even after she diagnosed herself, in effect, that she knew there was an issue, it took a couple years. Why was that?
We got misdiagnosis. She was young, so younger onset. They just said, we don't know what's going on. It could be primary progressive aphasia. It could be Lyme's disease. It could be MS. And it just took a long time to finally get enough information to say, no, this is Alzheimer's disease.
And then from that point on, and this is something you mentioned you were in school, and I think a lot of people in the audience can relate, is that this is something you're not taught in school. You don't know, and when you go through it, it's quite a difficult process, even if you were maybe taught about it or how to do it or how to go through the alphabet soup of community groups or government agencies if you're trying to get a new treatment. But can you describe kind of that process of that shock that your family experienced, even though your mom was in healthcare?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love the title of this session, More Than Memory Loss, because I think for probably a decade, some of that time before she was diagnosed and certainly after, my mom remembered who everyone was. I think The Notebook came out that year,
Yeah.
And my friends would say, well, she remembers who you are, right? And I just couldn't find the words to share with my peers, but our relationship is progressively changing. And then I think for me, I moved home. My sisters and I kind of each took some turns caring for my mom during different phases. And I was there and moved in with my mom and dad in my early 20s. So that was when my mom started to have the later stages of Alzheimer's. So woke up one day and asked my dad who he was, and then was afraid to sleep in the same bed as him. And then then I became anyone from, on a good day, her best friend. Getting pajamas on at night was like the most challenging thing, because she would always say, I want to go home. And she had like a go bag packed, and she was sure that her home was just down the street from us in North Carolina, her Iowa childhood home. And so I would be ideally like her best friend and say, here, Mom, here's some pajamas. Or I would say, here, I wouldn't say Mom. And then she'd say, don't you think your parents would mind? And I said, oh, no, I don't think they would.
If you called her Mom, what would she say?
It could just create confusion. I learned to not call my dad Dad. It was Ed, and because if I said Dad, it would trigger her best. I learned she had trauma with her dad who had left their family, and it would trigger her to have an emotional meltdown, and she'd
That's
revert
how you
back.
learned.
Yep, I learned that in her mind, if she had only joined the basketball team, he might not have left in her kind of 15-year-old state.
And after going through this extremely difficult process, you decided to really focus on this issue. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this month is my 7th year after co-founding a company that is called Embodied Labs. I'm the CEO. My older sister, Erin, is also a co-founder. And Embodied Labs is a platform, so I think someone said it earlier, it's hard to understand what someone's experiencing with Alzheimer's disease, and it's hard to understand what to expect and what's ahead of you. And I wished I could have embodied the hospice journey before we needed it, so that I knew hospice wasn't a death sentence, it was an incredible tool. I wish I could have practiced calming my mom down when she was agitated and pacing, so that we would have maybe avoided that fall and trip to the ER. And so what Embodied Labs does is it places you in the perspectives of the older adult that you're caring for. And one of our first educational programs we created was a journey through Alzheimer's disease. And I got training after I was caregiving for my mom in medical illustration. And so what we do is put together an advisory board. Actually, some of them have come from the Dementia Action Alliance, for example, of people living with Alzheimer's or whatever conditions we're simulating in first person, medical doctors, researchers, caregivers, and we create interactive scripts and stories that you can put on a fully immersive VR headset or just use an immersive browser-based platform. And we're now, and did some work writing to policymakers during the Master Plan on Aging in California's kind of prep, and we are part of the Cal Grows and a couple other ARPA-funded programs that this year in California will grow our footprint to 100,000 family caregivers and 5,000 direct care workers in the aging care space.
I do want to talk to you. What are the biggest misperceptions, you mentioned hospice care, that are out there that you'd like to dismantle?
Yeah, man, biggest, in terms of which perspective, the caregiver or the person with dementia?
Let's go both, yeah.
I think that caregivers need community and to not feel isolated and stigmatized. I think there's still, for most caregivers, they're working another job and they're doing the caregiving job.
Right.
So just like the ability to be able to be a caregiver and a part of society so that you're not isolated.
Your story is very powerful. Any kind of closing remarks, advice that you'd give?
I would say that we need to look at caregivers as patients themselves, and we need to find ways to give resources for caregivers, a mechanism through whether it's health plans, employers, payers, providers, community, nonprofit, all of us really need to come together and prioritize resources that support caregivers as a mental health care intervention. So finding the systems to pay and support that are going to be key, and I think we're ready for some much needed disruption given the volume that we're going to be dealing with here.
Well, that's pretty good advice. Thank you for sharing your story. Please thank Carrie Shaw for joining us. Thank you so much.